This week, we're going to be going over working with institutional review boards, or IRBs. I'm Steve Pope, and welcome back. So, in your role as a clinical research coordinator, you're going to be working with IRBs on a fairly regular basis. Um, I'll get into a little bit more about how they function a little bit later, but essentially, I want you to understand that institutional review boards are committees that are established to review, approve, and monitor research involving human subjects. So their primary purpose is to ensure the ethical and responsible treatment of research participants and to safeguard their rights and welfare. So they're there to look after the subjects that are involved in your clinical trials. So our learning objectives are going to be to define the primary mission of IRBs, describe the membership composition requirements for IRB committees, explain investigator reporting requirements for IRBs, discuss the IRB review and approval process, and then cite the IRB record keeping requirements. So I'll go over each of these as we move along in this lecture. So let's go over some of the IRB functions. Two here that we're going to talk about are going to be ethical review and approval and monitoring. So in the ethical review, the IRB is going to evaluate research proposals and protocols and make sure they comply with regulatory requirements. This also includes assessing the risk to subjects, the informed consent process, and also any measures that protect privacy and confidentiality. So that's going to be very important that your study be able to protect these items. The approval and monitoring. So before each research project can begin, they must approve, the IRB that is, must approve that study for use to be conducted at your site. So and then they continue to monitor that study throughout the duration of the study and make sure that the proper procedures are being complied with and the proper ethical standards are upheld. And they renew that approval every year. So the composition of the IRB committee, it typically includes members with diverse backgrounds, some scientists, some non-scientists, and sometimes community representatives. This diversity helps ensure that you get a comprehensive review of each research proposal from multiple perspectives. And I'm going to go over the composition a little bit later as we move along to provide a little bit more detail about that. As far as how they're regulated, they are regulated in the United States. IRBs operate under the regulations set by the Department of Health and Human Services and the Food and Drug Administration. Similar regulatory requirements exist in other countries as well. So in other countries, IRBs are generally referred to as ethics committees. So they operate very much the same way with a few little subtle differences. One of the primary functions that IRBs do is they review the informed consent documents that you use to consent subjects. And they also review the informed consent process. So this is a critical aspect of what they do. One of the things that you will do as a research coordinator is you'll have to get your informed consent documents approved by the IRB before you can begin consenting subjects into the study. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along in the course. Also, they're going to assess whether or not the potential benefits of the research outweigh the associated risks. There's going to be risk associated in every research study. Some are going to have very minimal risk. Others may have more prominent risks. So the IRB is going to assess that and determine whether or not that study can continue at your research site. Another function of IRBs is the resolution of conflicts of interest. So IRBs ensure that researchers don't have any conflict of interest or bias that might compromise a subject's welfare. So they monitor that and ensure that there's no undue conflict of interest in any of the studies that you're involved in. So the ICP, the ICH GCP guidelines that we studied in an earlier lecture, they break down the IRB requirements in the following areas. What are the IRB responsibilities? How does it pertain to composition, functions, and operations that IRBs operate under? What are the IRB procedures, and what are the records retainment requirements and records availability requirements of IRBs? IRBs generally operate a little independently. You'll have local IRBs, which are associated with academic research centers, and you'll have central IRBs, which are for-profit corporations that monitor research on behalf of investigators and sponsors and sites. So we'll get into these as we move along. So IRB responsibilities include the safeguard of human research subjects. The principal way they do that is by reviewing the clinical protocol, also reviewing the informed consent documents to assess what type of procedures and assessments are going to be done, what kind of medical interventions are going to be done throughout the study, and determine, what the safety element is for, for subjects participating in the study. So they're going to review all trial documents. That means any document that is handed to a subject. That could be an ICF, it could be a dosing diary, it could be some information about the study itself. Anything that's handed to a subject has to be reviewed by the IRB to make sure that it complies with all the appropriate safety guidelines. Finally, they review and approve the clinical trial protocol. So you're going to have a clinical trial protocol that discusses how your trial is going to be conducted at your site. They're going to review that. They may have questions that you may have some back and forth on that, but they will need to approve that before you can begin screening and enrolling subjects. So let's talk about the composition of IRBs. So first of all, they have to have at least 5 members, and of those 5 members, at least 1 member has to be from a non-scientific area. So it has to be someone who's not a doctor or who's not a scientific researcher. It could be someone who perhaps has training in law or theology or some other area like that. And then also 1 member has to be independent of the institution or trial site. Most of your local IRBs, or all of your local IRBs, are going to be affiliated with a specific research site. So many of their members are going to be employees of that site. So you need to have at least 1 member who is not employed by the site, comes from the local community, and can provide the point of view of the local community instead of the research site itself. IRBs have to use written standard operating procedures, or SOPs. They have to have written SOPs that discuss how they conduct meetings, how they go about their business, and these have to comply with GCP requirements. This also includes keeping meeting minutes. So everything the IRB does has to be documented. Every discussion, each meeting of the committee, who said what, all of that needs to be documented in the meeting minutes. And those meeting minutes have to be made available when asked for by an investigator or a sponsor or a regulatory authority. They also have to have a quorum in order to conduct a meeting. So they have to have a minimum number of its membership present at a meeting in order to conduct that meeting. They can allow only members who participate in the discussion to vote on a protocol. What that means is that the members have to participate in the discussion about a clinical study before they can be allowed to vote on whether or not that clinical study can move forward. So if they're absent from the deliberation, they're not allowed to vote if they miss that meeting, for instance. Now, here's another area that's very important. So IRBs can include input from the principal investigator, but the principal investigator is not allowed to be part of the deliberations or the discussion where the members are discussing whether or not to allow the study to move forward, and they're not allowed to vote. So this happens a lot simply because many PIs are also members of institutional review boards. So a PI may be a member of the local IRB membership committee, but when that occurs, they have to recuse themselves from the discussion about the protocol and from any voting. Now, they can be on hand to answer questions that the IRB may have, but they're not allowed to vote on the study approval. This will happen occasionally. You may be in a situation where you have to write a letter signed by the principal investigator indicating that they were on hand for information purposes only at the meeting, but they did not engage in any IRB deliberations, and they did not engage in any voting on their particular protocol. So the IRB has to notify members of its committee of scheduled meetings. Usually these will be scheduled far in advance, so those members will know when the meetings are to occur. They can't hold any secret meetings with only a portion of the membership. They have to let the entire membership know when the scheduled meetings are to occur. So they're going to conduct the initial review of your protocol, your study, determine whether or not it's approved, and then they're going to do continuing review of that same research as you go along, because your research study, it may last several years, and so you'll have to get continuing review approval of your study as you go along, and you'll do that each year. Otherwise, you run the risk of your study falling into this category of no IRB review, which is not a good thing to have happen. They're going to require that no subject be enrolled before the trial approval has occurred. They're going to establish that investigator reporting requirements such as deviations, safety, changes in risk, anything that changes during that study, the investigator must report that to the IRB, and in addition to other aspects that occur during the trial, which we'll get into a little bit later. IRBs have to establish records retention requirements. They're required to retain records for at least 3 years after the completion of a trial, and they have to make those records available upon request from any regulatory authority. So that also includes, if they need, if there are certain records that the sponsor may need, they have to make those available as well. Let's talk about the protocol submission process, because this is what you're going to be involved in your clinical research coordinator role. So first is the initial proposal. So this is when the doctor or the research team submits a detailed research proposal to the IRB. It's going to include the study objectives, methodology, recruitment strategies, informed consent forms, and plans for data protection. So this is going to include, if you're working on a drug protocol, the sponsor's protocol that you've been working with, the IRB is going to receive a copy of that. There's also going to be supporting documents that go along with that. So, that would be anything like questionnaires or interview guides. A lot of studies use patient-reported outcome questionnaires, either in paper form or in electronic form. All that has to be submitted to and approved by your IRB before you can use it. Any advertising that you might use to advertise for subjects, that has to be approved as well. So during the initial review, the IRB is going to they're going to assess what the ethical implications of the study are, what the risk and benefits to subjects are, and then the adequacy of the informed consent process. Does it adequately inform the participants what the risk and benefits are before they agree to participate in the study? So you'll also have two different types of review. One is going to be full board review versus expedited review. So depending on the level of risk involved, the proposal might undergo a full board review that involves the entire membership of the IRB, or it can go under expedited review, which is only handled by a few members and is more of a administrative process. If there was a small change or small update to the protocol, that could probably go for expedited review. And this would be something that the IRB would need to clearly indicate in its operating procedures, what elements of approval need full board review versus expedited review. So feedback and revisions. The IRB may request modifications to the study protocol or additional information that you might be using. So this is a very common thing, particularly when it comes to informed consent documents. They may want language that more adequately spells out what the risk to the study to participation is, those types of things. So you're going to be involved in addressing these, and you're going to need to resubmit those as part of your submission process. So the way that you would very likely do that is most IRBs are going to have some sort of submission portal where you would upload documents to that portal, and that's how you would go about with the submission process. Once the IRB is satisfied that the study meets ethical and regulatory standards, then it grants approval, and the approval must be obtained before the research can commence. So let's talk about that for a moment. IRBs are going to issue an approval letter. So what happens there is that the committee meets, they approve the research on a certain date, they generate an approval letter probably the following day, and then that gets sent out to the sites. So until you have an approval letter, you do not have a formal approval yet. So you can't do anything until you have an approval letter with a date on it that your IRB approved your protocol, your study for use. So amendments, these are commonly called protocol amendments. You will have protocol amendments during the course of your study. Those are going to come, in most cases, they're going to come directly from the sponsor, where they may have to modify a procedure or a process, or they may expand the study to involve more subjects. Those would be examples of protocol amendments and they would need to be approved by your IRB before you can implement the details of that amendment. So the approval process is similar to the initial review. You just go through provide whatever documents the IRB needs in order to approve that amendment, and then they'll send you a letter approving Amendment 1 or Amendment 2 dated a certain date. Also, adverse events reporting. Researchers, PIs are required to report any unexpected adverse events or unanticipated problems involving risk to participants to the IRB promptly. It's important for you to understand what your IRB reporting requirements are. For example, many IRBs only want to know about serious adverse events. Those are adverse events involving either death, hospitalization, prolongation of hospitalization, life-threatening. There's a series of criteria that goes into what a serious adverse event is, and we'll discuss those a little bit later. You're going to collect adverse events during the study. An adverse event is going to be anything from a headache to a heart attack. So they could be very minor, they might be major. But you're going to accumulate a lot of them. Not every one of them needs to be reported to your IRB. So it's important for you to understand what their reporting requirements are. Good rule of practice is to go ahead and report it and have the IRB acknowledge that they received your report, even if they come back and say this really is not a reportable event. So as the clinical research coordinator, you're going to be required to submit progress reports on a periodic basis to your IRB. These are generally done annually as part of the continuing review process, but they're going to want to know some updates on the trial. For example, the number of subjects that have been enrolled, if there's been any serious adverse event, any SUSARs or any not warning letters, but serious adverse event letters, safety letters that have gone out to sites. They'll want to know what that is. And generally you're going to do that at the minimum of one time each year. If you do get safety letters during your study, these are letters that are sent to all of the principal investigators that involved serious adverse drug reactions. Those generally are also going to be submitted to your IRB as well. So we'll go over that a little bit further in the safety lecture that we'll have coming up a little later. Renewal applications. You're going to have to submit for renewal every year. So in most cases, the IRB is going to alert you probably 1 to 2 months prior to your expiration date and prompt you to get your renewal submission in so that they have time to review it and give you continuing review of your study. So for a final report and study closure, these are done at the completion or the termination of the trial. Usually what will occur is you will have a closeout visit from your monitor, from the sponsor. They're going to come in, and at that point, normally on that date or probably the following day, you're going to submit to your IRB that the study is now closed at your site. The monitor is going to want to collect the acknowledgement from the IRB that you have submitted that. Then the researcher is going to submit a final report to the IRB a little bit later, probably another week or two after that. And then usually you'll get a letter back from your IRB that says, as of this date, the study is closed at your site and you're not to work on any more activities for that particular study. The principal investigator also has to ensure that all data is handled according to the approved protocol, including proper storage, confidentiality, and disposal of any procedures. So another concern is in education and training. So IRBs usually require principal investigators and coordinators to go through a certain amount of training before they are eligible to work on research studies. So these might be things like GCP training, that may have certain institutional training that they require in order for you to conduct research. So this is something that you'll need to be aware of. It's probably something you'll need to prompt the investigator, the sub-investigators, and other staff members that work on your studies to get those training sessions completed. So you have some reading assignments coming up, which basically amplify what I've gone over in this lecture. One is the chapter on IRBs in your textbook. Also, I want you to take a look at the actual ICH E6 section as it pertains to institutional review boards and independent ethics committees. So then finally, for your online assignment for this week, I've given you the link to the Mayo Clinic, where we're going to review their IRB policy manual. So you don't have to read the whole thing. All I want you to do is become familiar with it, kind of see what it looks like, and then you've got a couple of questions there that I want you to answer. So you're probably going to have to perhaps dig around a little bit in that policy manual in order to find them. But this would be a good real world exercise for some of you in your first assignment, in your first clinical research coordinator job. You're going to have to go out there and probably find these and make sure you know what the answers to some of these questions are. So take a look at that. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll be reviewing your content online.